The wind dragged itself across the flatlands like a wounded horse, carrying with it the dry grit of late summer. Dust clung to every surface, bridges, wagons, the hides of cattle, the hems of skirts flapping in the merciless heat. In the middle of it all, the town of Red Mesa crouched under the sun like a stubborn dog in the shade of a corral. It was a place where men wore their grudges as openly as their hats, and women learned early that silence could be safer than speech. Tom Callahan rode into town just as the sun had begun to burn the edges of the horizon. His horse, a gray mare named Mercy, stepped carefully through the thickening dust, hooves raising little clouds with each measured stride. Callahan himself was a quiet man, lean and tall, with shoulders set like carved stone. His eyes, a pale blue, rarely betrayed thought. He carried no guns across his chest, only the promise of steady hands and the weight of a past he never spoke of. He passed the saloon first, hearing the low hum of conversation and the scrape of chairs across the worn wooden floor. Inside, laughter clinked like glass against glass. Outside, the sun painted the town in molten amber. Callahan's gaze lingered for a moment on a girl standing at the hitching post, her dress patched and faded, her hands balled around the reins of a nervous pony. There was a hardness in her face, the kind that only came from carrying burdens too heavy for her years. She looked up at him, suspicion in the curve of her jaw. He tipped his hat, said nothing, and let the silence pass between them like the dust in the wind. The auction yard lay at the edge of town, a low fenced square where merchants and ranchers gathered to buy and sell whatever could be fenced or saddled. Today there was more than cattle waiting under the noon sun. A man with a lantern jaw and a black mustache stood on the platform, hawking a lot of 6 girls like they were a herd of yearling horses. Callahan stopped, hearing the words that made his chest tighten. Good stock, obedient, will fetch a fine price. He recognized the cruel gleam in the auctioneer's eyes, the way men leaned forward, calculating profit instead of conscience. He watched the girls from the shadow of a corral post. Their eyes were wide, frantic. One of them, younger than the rest, clutched at her skirts like they might be torn away from her at any moment. They weren't cattle, not to him, not even in the rough ways of the frontier. Callahan dismounted, the sound of hooves thudding through the dust, and moved closer. Nobody spoke. The auctioneer, a man called Harlan Jinks, caught sight of him and smiled a thin, false smile. Well, if it ain't Callahan. You here to buy? Yourself trouble? I'm not buying, Callahan said, his voice low, but steady, like a whip held tight. I'm ending it. The auctioneer's smile twitched. Ending it? Callahan didn't answer with words. He stepped onto the platform, boots thudding, and the crowd shifted uneasily. There was a long silence, the kind that stretched out until the heat itself seemed to hesitate. The girls froze. Some whispered to each other in voices trembling with fear. Too soft for anyone but Callahan to hear. You ain't got the law on your side, Callahan, Jinks said. You'll be hung or worse. I don't need the law, Callahan replied. His hand rested lightly on the grip of his revolver. Not a threat. A promise? The first shot cut through the air before anyone could flinch. Men shouted, guns were drawn, and the dust rose like smoke from a fire. Callahan moved quickly, a shadow among shadows, untying the girls and ushering them toward Mercy. The youngest one looked up at him with tears streaking her dusty cheeks. Are you going to hurt us? She asked. No, Callahan said. I'm getting you out. It took half an hour, but by the time the sheriff's men arrived, horses skidding in the dirt, boots pounding, they found the corral empty, the auction platform splintered, and no sign of Callahan or the girls. Callahan led the girls into the broken stretches of desert behind Red Mesa, where the sun scoured the land and the wind carried the taste of grit and sage. They rode in silence at first. Mercy's hooves struck the hard earth with a steady rhythm, and Callahan kept a hand lightly on the youngest girl's shoulder, reassuring without speaking. Each girl rode as though afraid to move, afraid that some invisible chain would pull them back into the hands of men who had no measure for mercy. They stopped near a wash, a shallow gully where the water had long ago dried, leaving only cracked mud and the faint scent of salt. Callahan knelt, letting the girls dismount, and unrolled a canteen. The youngest, who had taken to calling herself Lila without asking permission, drank greedily, coughing and spluttering through the grit in the water. The others hung back, wary, eyes flicking to the horizon as if expecting pursuit at any moment. "You can't stop us forever," one of the older girls said, voice brittle. She was tall and wiry, with hair knotted into a messy braid. "They'll find us." Callahan didn't answer immediately. He studied the horizon, the haze rising off the distant mesas. "Maybe," he said finally, "but you've got to start now. You've got the ground under your feet, and they don't." It wasn't much of a comfort, not for them, but it was something real. Callahan had learned long ago that words could only carry you so far. Actions quiet, deliberate, steady were what kept you alive. The ride north that followed was slow and measured. Callahan knew the land like the lines on his palms. He knew where water lingered under rocks, where the wind would hide tracks, where a man could vanish and leave nothing but the sun and sand behind. At night, he set up a small fire while the girls slept in a semicircle around him. He didn't ask their names beyond Lila, letting them tell him in fragments and whispers. Each story they shared was a shard of broken life, sold, coerced, left, alone to fend for a world that had no use for girls like them. Callahan's own past weighed on him like a lead saddle. He had lost more than he cared to count: family, friends, his own sense of belonging, and yet he had survived. That survival had given him a strange kind of patience, a calm that came from knowing there was no undoing what had been done, only what could still be made right. By the fourth day, the desert had changed its character. The mesas gave way to scrubland, and the wind carried the smell of juniper and dry pine. They came upon a small ranch, abandoned except for a windmill that creaked with the wind. Callahan tied Mercy to a post and let the girls rest while he inspected the perimeter. There were signs of squatters' long-gone footprints fading into dust, bones of rabbits picked clean by coyotes. It wasn't much, but it was a place to hide Dot as the girls settled down. One of them, Mara, the eldest, approached him cautiously. Why help us?" she asked. Callahan didn't answer right away. He knelt to examine the windmill, listening to the creak of the blades against the sun-baked air. "Because someone had to," he said finally. "Someone should have." The girls seemed to understand that the answer was enough. In the quiet, they began to eat a sparse meal he had scavenged from a nearby abandoned cabin. Jerky, dried beans, and water from a canteen. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the scrubland, and the first stars began to prick the sky with silver points. It wasn't long before trouble found them. A scouting party from Red Mesa rode into the scrubland, 5 men in the dusty gray of lawmen. Though none carried the badge of justice, only the authority that fear could buy. Callahan spotted them. First, sitting quietly atop a rise, eyes narrowed against the sun. He didn't panic, he never did. Not with a gun, not with a horse, not with a life to protect, he whispered to the girls, moving them quietly behind the windmill. "Stay low," he said. "Do exactly what I say." The men rode closer, the sound of hooves against hard earth cracking through the stillness. Their leader, a broad man named Sheriff Calloway, had a mouth full of whiskey and teeth that were too yellow to trust. "Callahan," he shouted, "we know you're here. Hand over the girls and we'll call it even." Callahan stepped out from behind the windmill, dusty and tall in the fading light. He didn't raise his gun yet, didn't rush. He let the silence stretch, let the wind and dust make the air heavy and expectant. "You call that even?" Callahan said, voice low but carrying. "Selling girls like cattle?" Calloway spat to the side. "Business is business, Callahan. You can't stop the law." Callahan's hand went to his revolver, but he didn't draw. Instead, he waited, watched. The men shifted uneasily. He knew the moment would pass if he didn't act with precision. The girls peeked from their hiding spots, silent and tense, trusting him more than anything else in their lives. The first shot came from Mercy, the mare breaking loose from her tie and kicking up dust as she bolted through the midst of the men, scattering them like leaves. Callahan drew his gun in a smooth motion, not aiming to kill but to disable and intimidate. Men went down with bruised shoulders and stunned legs. One man tried to draw, and Callahan was faster, knocking the gun from his hand with a crack of gun metal against gun metal. By the time the dust settled, the lawmen were limping, cursing, and bleeding from minor wounds. Callahan rounded the girls up, mounting them two at a time behind him. Mercy carried them swiftly into the night, and the last they saw of Red Mesa was the flicker of lanterns disappearing in the dust. They traveled for 2 more days, skirting lawmen, finding water where none should be, sleeping beneath the stars, sharing stories and laughter that was raw and fragile. Callahan began to see a change in the girls, not the kind born of safety, but of agency. They were no longer just victims to be rescued. They were learning how to survive. One evening, as the sun sank behind jagged mesas, Mara spoke to him quietly, voice barely above the wind. "You saved us," she said. "But what about you? Who saves you?" Callahan didn't answer immediately. He kicked at the dust with the toe of his boot, looking toward the horizon. "No one," he said finally. "Not anymore. But I've got this," he added, gesturing to the girls behind him. "And that's enough." It was a truth he had learned long ago. Sometimes the only way to save yourself was to save someone else first. By the time they reached the edge of another town, smaller, quieter, with people who looked at strangers with curiosity rather than hunger, Callahan knew he had a choice. He could keep moving, stay the wandering ghost of the frontier, or he could settle, try to build something like a home in the ruins of what the world had offered him. The girls, sensing his hesitation, didn't push. They simply looked to him with eyes that had seen too much, yet still believed in small ways that someone could act with decency. Callahan found a small ranch, a place abandoned but with shelter, water, and room for new life. Over the next weeks, they repaired fences, coaxed water from the old well, and planted whatever seeds could take root in the dry earth. There were nights when silence hung heavy, when the past crept back like a shadow across the mesas, but the work, the labor, the shared effort, it was enough to keep ghosts at bay. And then one evening, as the sun set like molten gold behind the distant mesas, Lila came to him with a small bundle of wildflowers, dusty but vibrant. "For you," she said. "For everything." Callahan took them quietly, holding them in calloused hands, smelling the faint scent of life in the desert air. He realized then that he had been saved not by gunfire or vengeance, not by law or luck, but by the very humanity he had offered to others. They watched the sun dip below the horizon. And for the first time in years, Callahan felt something he had thought lost forever, the quiet, unremarkable, almost miraculous sense that life, for all its dust and blood, could still hold grace. The wind carried the scent of sage and juniper across the mesas, and Callahan felt the weight of his past, loosened just enough to breathe. The girls laughed quietly behind him, voices like wind through the canyons, and he knew the world could still be cruel, but not tonight. Tonight, there was something better than survival. Tonight, there was a beginning.